Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the history in Palestine of at least what I know of it, because it's a story that's been told that I did not live through. But of course, it contributed to my later life, and as I grew up in a Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon. From what I know, I've heard many things about life, and let me say something here actually before I start. Uh, the experience of 1948 really was rarely shared with us as children. I think parents were reluctant to talk about it unless you go really and ask the specific questions about it. So my early knowledge or familiarity with Palestine was really before the 48, as to how they were living in a, in I belong to an old Arab tribe called Al-Hayb, Arab tribe that lived close to Al-Zib in northern historical Palestine. And you hear about all these stories about living there and how the community was living and how even, how can I say, the social relationships within the community. And I'll give you an example of that because it is part of my life. My father ended up marrying my mother as part of that social relationship, in the sense where my grandfather, paternal grandfather, I believe, owed some money to my maternal grandfather. And as part of that deal, they decided that my dad would marry my mom. They did not have much of a choice, kids. I mean, they ended up, of course, respecting the decision of the elders, and they got married. My dad was a young, very young man at the time. My mom was very, very young, barely reached maturity, possibly. And it took them about 7 years before they had their first child in 1947. And then I would have to say history really took a different turn from that point on. You stop hearing about life in Palestine, farming, land, trades, riding horses. I think was one of the most joyful description or history you hear sometimes from your parents. And then the whole thing seems to just stopped suddenly. Uh, and there, you start really asking questions as to what happened. And then they would be forced to tell you some of the stories. The first stories I know of or I learned is that my father joined what they call the Arab Salvation Army. It was an army that was founded by the Arab League at the time to try to help the Palestinians defend their land. The problem is it was really not a Palestinian entity by itself, and it was controlled by outside power, which basically Arab governments. And you have to remember that Arab governments at that era, they were either just got out of colonial control, where they have basically vassal states, if I could say that. They were not free and independent in their own way. My father left my mother and his parents basically to join the army. And what I was told, my mom had the baby who was months old on her shoulder basically, and walked away from their living area by Al Zib and moved into other towns like El Kabri. And as they moved, the Zionist military force or terrorists at the time, because they were really terrorizing the population, they kept moving ahead of the Zionist push. They told me when I asked them questions, specific questions actually, as to what led you to start moving. They talked about massacres like in Sufsaf, it's a village within that region, within the area they live. They talked about Tantura and of course Deir Yassin, even though it's a little bit further south. But the ones just close by, Sasa, also when they went during the night, the Zionist military, paramilitary groups and blew up homes when people were asleep in them, in that village in Sasa. So they kept moving from one town to the other, basically trying to evade or move away from the Israeli planes at the time, until they reached South Lebanon. At that stage, my parents, my father and my mother and his parents were separated. They did not know where everyone is. He was with the army and they were with the refugees. They settled in a small village in the south, and from there they moved to Anjar in East Bekaa, in the East Valley, Lebanon. And when they settled in this town, Anjar, it's called, my uncle, actually, who's my aunt's husband, went and, let me put it this way: my father's parents, they begged him to go look for him. Where is he? Whatever happened to him? Did he die? Is he alive? So this uncle went into a journey and went to the old bases of this Arab Salvation Army to Syria, looking for him, and by moving from one base to the other until he was able to find him, and there was a big reunion between them. And I remember part of the story where now he's ready, my uncle ready to go back to tell them that he found my dad. They knew that nobody was going to believe them, so what what they did, he went and he bought some dress for my brother who was like months old, and for my cousin who's the son of my uncle. Also, he was born about the same time as my brother, so he sent them a gift. So that way they kind of felt, yeah, he's okay, and they know where he is. Soon after that, they reunited in Anjar when the Arab Salvation Army was dismantled completely, because they did not do the job that they were supposedly wanted to do. When I say wanted to do, being the members of the group, the fighting group, because they really wanted to defend the Palestinian villages. But what happened, and this is a fact that many people don't know, that the Arab Salvation Army was basically directed not to fight beyond the 1947 partition, that partitioned Palestine between a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. They basically were told, you defend the new boundary. And that is something that nobody even knows about. And this is related to the fact that these Arab states were not really independent. They did not represent the aspiration of their own people, but still were part of a colonial power. As an example, in Jordan, Globe Basha, he was a British officer. He was the head of the Jordanian army. So he was really executing, the wishes of the British government more so than the wishes of the Jordanian people or monarchy. So that is part of I would say, the first part of that struggle. And from there on, when the Salvation Army was dismantled because it did not do what it's supposed to do or have done, my parents moved from Anjar to an area in North Lebanon, and there they settled next to a river called Nahar al-Barid, which is the cold river. When they lived there, along with about 5,000 Palestinians, refugees, the camp came to be known as Nahar al-Barid camp, which is the cold river camp. And it was situated, I would say, to the extreme, the north extreme of Lebanon. And there were many stories as to how this camp came about. I would like to mention something about it because that's very critical. When Palestinians were forced to move away from Palestine, many of them, or most of them actually, settled in the south area, which is in the close proximity to historical Palestine. And many of them still had what you might say, a special connection to their land. They continued to cross the border. and visit their farms and their land. Many of them would even go and pick fruits from their land and come back. Many, and this is an interesting part of it, many would bring soil and put it in jars in their homes, in new homes in Lebanon, temporary homes as far as they were concerned, to just keep the connection between them and the land. At that point, the Lebanese government entered into a ceasefire, with the new state, and was worried that the presence of the Palestinians in the south would possibly or potentially cause political or military conflict between Lebanon and the new state. So what they did, they made sure to move as many Palestinians from the south toward the north area as possible. So they were basically put in a train and moved from the south to the last train station in Lebanon, and that was in Tripoli, in an area called Al Mina, or the port. There, most of these people settled in an old French military quarters. Was abandoned military quarters for the French. They settled there for a while, and then they moved part of them from this French quarters to an area called Khan al-Askar in Tripoli itself, which is close to also a river, big river in the middle of the city. And the other part, they moved them to Nahr al-Barid, what became Nahr al-Barid. My family came from Anjar also and moved to Nahr al-Barid. The other group that moved to this Khan al-Askar in Tripoli ended up moving to another area in North Lebanon called Baddawi. After a big flood in the Abu Ali River in Tripoli, basically the flood, took over all the shanty homes, you're gonna call it, that were around the river, and destroyed everything. So they moved them, the UN moved them to an area just on the edge of Tripoli, and the camp came to be known al-Baddawi. And now they have about 13 camps in Lebanon, 2 of them in the north, al-Baddawi and Nahr al-Barid. Nahr al-Barid is the second largest camp in Lebanon, with an interesting story that hopefully I will be talking about it later on in this, which resulted in its complete destruction in 2007. And again, the same people who built homes for 62 years, or at that time 60 years, they were forced out of the camp, and all the homes were completely demolished. And I will talk about it in more detail, hopefully, as we go. But this is really how the story started, from Palestine to Lebanon. This is just one part of the refugee, the Palestine refugees. I mean, some were, of course, pushed into the West Bank, into Jordan, and some were pushed into Gaza. And some, by the way, stayed in Palestine, were about 150,000 at the time. And what happened, the Israelis, basically, after they established the new nationality law, they denationalized all the Palestinians, and then gave citizenship rights to those native Palestinians. However, they moved them from their original villages to some other villages that remain within Palestine, without allowing them to claim their properties that they left in their original villages. So their properties basically were gone also, while they became citizens of the new state. At that time, like I said, 150,000, about 127, I believe, into Lebanon, refugees, 127,000. In total, about 805,000 Palestinians were made refugees in 1948, whereby 531 villages were completely demolished. And like I said, the remaining villages were used to basically take as a refugee sites for the remaining Palestinians that accepted to stay within the new Israeli states in 1948.
A couple of just specifics to follow up on what you were saying. Which district was Ilzit, your village, your parents' village? Which district was it in? Was it in Akka?
In Akka.
In Akka.
Yeah, it was just north of Akka, close to what it became known as Nahariya. So it was on the shorelines. However, because they really didn't necessarily believe that they were going to leave Palestine, and they really thought it was a short evacuation, if you might say. They did not go north on the shorelines. They moved inland within the Galilee area, because they thought just they're moving from one village to another, and eventually they gotta go back. And with that, they took basically none of their belonging with them. I know of a story of a relative of mine, by the way, and this story I did not even know about it until possibly later in age. Because, like I said, the hard stories they don't share it with you. I wrote a book, by the way, and I mentioned this story in the book. And this guy named Abu Musa, he was with the family when they were evacuating their homes. And with him, he has a child who was about also my oldest brother's age, and his wife, and his handicapped mom. His handicapped mom, can't basically doesn't lost her vision. She cannot walk, so he had her on his back, and with his wife carrying her son, and they both, all of them, moving inland, trying to hide from Israeli or at the time Zionist paramilitary raids. And during a tense raid, he got to the point where, and this is very sad, where he threw or tried to hide his mom in a ditch next to the road, because he couldn't continue carrying her and running away from the planes. He put her in a ditch, and they ran away. They ran away to a distance, area, until, because of the raid continued. He couldn't go back to check on her until next day. And when he went next day, he found some villagers basically trying to collect after the raid, and he couldn't find his mom anywhere. And he asked them. He said, have you seen an old woman here somewhere? I left my mom. And they said, we just buried an older woman that was basically eaten by animals. Buried her here. And that story, until now, whenever I hear it, I really get emotional about it. And Abu Musa never lived a normal life after that. I mean, I don't know if it's his mother's cares or what, but he lived close, to my family in the camp. And I made the point of visiting him every time I go to the camp. But before I say something about that, I must say that his oldest son, the one who left Palestine as a baby, was killed in 1972, I believe, 71, around that time, when he tried to cross, the borders between Lebanon and what became Israel, and he was killed on the spot. And of course, he was never repatriated to his family, so they never seen him. His name is Musa. I have fond memories of Musa. Later, also in the early 1990s, his youngest son also was basically butchered on a checkpoint in North Lebanon, in Tripoli, for belonging to the wrong party or the wrong group, or being in the wrong place, the wrong time, basically. So Kamal, his name, was butchered from one end to another in his neck. And Abu Musa, that's really the story of his life, and I think it's a story of one Palestinian life. Whenever I visited him, whenever I visited Lebanon, I tried to visit with him. And the last time I saw him, he became, by the way, handicapped or paralyzed. He couldn't stand and walk. I would say since the mid-70s until he died. So last time I went to visit him, he was in the bathroom, outside yard bathroom, and there he came crawling, an old man on his hands. So I kneeled down and to kiss him and say hi. He kissed me back, and he would ask me, "Who are you, my son?" You know, I mean, he lost complete his memory completely. He lost his physical power completely, and he lost really his dearest mom and kids. And this is just one story of a Palestinian in the camp. I could talk for days about those kind of experiences. But these stays with us no matter where we live as Palestinians, because they're part of our connection to the land and to the people that we're part of. And that is something I would say part of the story that the West does not understand about what Palestinians have gone through.
Yeah, to go back to the village, all of the people were kicked out of the village in 48. Do you know what month it was? What and what?
Yeah, I was told actually it was soon after, and this is an interesting point how they left their villages. It was soon after Deir Yassin and around before May 15, and this is an important point, before May 15, 1948. And that is another fact that people tend not to know or ignore, that by May 15, which Palestine was still under the British mandate, by May 15 or before May 15, about 419,000 Palestinians were made homeless and were pushed out of their homes. That is while Palestine was supposedly, or the Palestinian people was supposedly under the protection of the British mandate power. So the British mandate power did not even exercise the responsibility to protect the population of Palestine. So 50% of those refugees I mentioned that were made refugees in 1948 were made refugees even before the end of the mandate and before the creation of the State of Israel. And I believe that there should be an international obligation on the British government, even today, for what they did to the Palestinians in 1948. So the transformation of Palestine from a Palestinian majority state to, I would say, to a powerful minority group, which has been the Zionist or the Jewish refugees from Europe, was really prepared by the British after their mandate, or between 1923 the official mandate, 1923 to 1948. So the transformation or the demographic changes in Palestine started to take place when the British assigned Samuel as a governor of Palestine. Samuel was a known Zionist, Jewish Zionist, British Jewish Zionist. They appointed him as the governor of Palestine, and he took it upon himself to lead the change in the demographic of Palestine. That, like I said, led to forcing 50% of the Palestinians into refuge while Palestine was under the protection, so-called protection of the mandate power.
Yeah, I mean, I've read that the forcing the expulsion of the Palestinians began 3 days after the United Nations Resolution 194. Was it November 29th,
Right.
1947, and
Right.
3 days after, the Zionist forces started to
Exactly,
expel
to what they call ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and that is an important fact. I think that we really sometimes need to highlight. I'm not sure if we fail to highlight, or the media fails to allow us to highlight it. And that is the fact that 50% of the Palestinian refugees in 1948 were made refugees while Palestine was under the protection of the British power.
Right. Which a lot of the Zionists claim that it was just during war the war hadn't even really started.
Exactly, war hasn't even started, and also, the Zionist claim, and this is another issue that we need to point out. The Zionist claim that Palestinians left voluntarily because the Arab governments asked them to leave, and this is really one of the many lies that seems to have found credentials in the West somehow, or accepted as a fact in the West, which based on total fabricated history. As an example, there was a big research done to review the BBC files to try to find the claims, or to substantiate the claim that the Zionists made, and that Arab radios asked the Palestinians to leave their homes. They could not find any records within the BBC files to indicate that anybody asked the Palestinians to leave their homes. So the Palestinians never really voluntarily left their homes. They were forced to leave their homes. And more importantly, they were forced to leave their homes while Palestine was under protection, supposedly. So I mean, these are some of the facts that are delivered totally different in the West, based on fabricated history. I mean, as an example, I'll give you another example, another fabricated history, and that is after November 29th, 1947, when the United Nations voted to partition Palestine. The first thing that happened in there is that they decided to partition Palestine between two states, one Jewish state, one Palestinian state. And the Palestinian state had about 10,000 Jews in it, while the vast majority were Palestinians, native Palestinians. The Jewish state, on the other hand, had about 60,000 Jews and 40,000 native Palestinians. And soon after the vote, the Zionists claimed to have accepted the partition. Well, I mean, naturally, they would have to accept taking what wasn't theirs in the first place, which is 55% of Palestine. 55% of Palestine was given to the new group of refugees coming from Europe, while they owned less than 7% of Palestine. This is documented fact by Jewish writers, Israeli writers. This is a fact actually even collaborated to a degree with the Jewish National Fund, which owned supposedly the Jewish land. They claim they owned about 12%, but historical records shows that they owned less than 7% of the land. So they took 55% of the land. So of course, naturally they're gonna accept it, and naturally the Palestinians gonna reject it. I mean, why would I give up 45% of my right, 55% of my land to some foreign group? But that's not the point here. My point here is even Ben-Gurion, who was the leader of the Zionist movement, in a speech to the Histerdort, which is the Labor Party of the Zionist organization, he gave a speech soon after the 1947 vote to partition Palestine, rejecting the partition and basically stating that there is no way we can have, and here I'm paraphrasing, there's no way we can have a secure Jewish state with only 60% Jew. It has to be much higher percentage. And basically, less than 6 months later, he did exactly that. He made sure that he would carry ethnic cleansing operations to try to depopulate Palestine, to make sure that he has more than 60% Jewish majority in the new Jewish state.
Let's talk a little bit about the camp Nahr al-Balad. You talked about the people being moved from the south to the north. Was that 1949 or 1950?
That was in 1949 when they started moving people from the south to the north. And actually, when they moved them in 1949, they also, during the cold winter season, that's another fact I heard, that East Bekaa Valley in Lebanon was very cold at the time, and people were living in tents. So they really wanted to move them to a warmer area, the ones in Anjar. So they moved them to the same place where they moved the people from the south also, and settled on the shorelines of the Mediterranean in what became Nahr al-Bared camp. And we have some original photos of that period that shows the camp and tents, which really grew from what you might say a muddy tents in 1949 to one of the most vibrant camps, commercially speaking, in Lebanon by 2007, and then of course leading to its complete destruction in the summer of 2007.
I think one of the interesting things is that when people think of camps, they still think of people living in tents. They don't have this vision that it's become a city within a city, so to speak. You know, that the camps have started, you know, with the tents, but then they go to these little cinder block homes, and then they build one floor on top of one floor.
Good
Can
point.
you talk about the visuals? When you grew, what year were you born?
1958.
And you know, as you start to become aware, like your early memories, what did this environment look like?
Yeah, let me start actually with what I call the transformation of the camp. Back in 1949, when they started building the camps, they built the tents. And people, lived in tents for many years because they really refused to the sense of settlement. They didn't want to build homes because they still lived on the hope that they are going back to Palestine. So the sense of leaving the tent into a building structure was like in a way, they're selling out, and they didn't want to do that. Up until I would say mid 50s, 1955, 1956, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, that was created in 1950 by the UN to help settle possibly the Palestinian refugees or help provide services to the Palestinian refugees. At that stage in 1956, they decided to build up the camp. You know, instead of tents, start building homes to give people some sense of settlement in a way. And people, that was the first revolt in the camp, I would say, in the mid-50s. They revolted against the proposal, the UNRWA United Nations proposal, and many took their tents and dumped them in the office. They were asked to do that by organizers, dumped them by the UN office and set them on fire to protest what they called it the conspiracy of the UN to have them settle in other places other than their home. However, 2 years later, I must say, the refugees, started to, I don't want to say give up. They never gave up, but started to have sense of, it's been long. We possibly need to start building homes, and they started building rudimentary homes. I must say, things at clay, rocks. They dug stones and start building homes. Or rooms. I mean, one of the bedroom I grew up with, actually, it had, I think three walls. Still were from the old home that my parents built back in late 50s until it was destroyed. Of course, one was clay wall and the other. Two clay walls, and the other was stones, and you could see the stones from outside. So I was born in 1958, and I was told I was the first born from the family in a room, not in a tent. My oldest brother was born in Palestine. My older brother was born in 1954 in a tent. In 1958, I was born in a room. And from there, the camp started building. However, it was under the control of the Lebanese authority, whereby building or renovation was very strict. I mean, the Lebanese government would not allow Palestinians to build more than walls and have some kind of tin sheeting on the roof. Up until 1969, when the camp had an uprising, and basically the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, took over the camp. And when that happened, we had, I would say, flares of construction. I mean, construction was an active event in the camp because people were, in the same area, in the same homes, basically, that were erected back in the 50s. But now families have grown, and their kids get married, and they have other children, so they wanted to expand. And that led to, I would say, the worst disorganized building expansion in the camp, where alleys, people were infringing on the alleys, people were allowed to build concrete roof, and then they would extend the balcony over the alley because there's no room. I mean, and the camp still was limited within its original boundary. It wasn't allowed to expand beyond the original boundary. Led to the point where I would say the camp became like a cylinder block. I mean, if you look from the aerial, you just see concrete. I mean, I remember the camp when you would look, when you're away from the camp, like half a mile outside the camp, you look back at the camp, it's all green. Every house had grapevines or trees. I mean, but the grapevines was a must in each home. However, when this building started, they had to take the grapevines and put concrete. So after that, you will see a concrete block, basically, up until 82, and that's another transformation in the camp. In 1982, with the Israeli invasion of South Lebanon, many of the Palestinians from the camps in the south area, like Al-Rashidiyya, Burj al-Shamali, Ain al-Hilwa, they moved north also, and they settled in the schools, in the classrooms in the camp. Before that, also there was a small group that also came from Tel Zatar. Tel Zatar is another camp that was completely destroyed, demolished by the so-called Lebanese Christian forces. And those who were not massacred, basically, and who made it out, some of them settled in the camp. So what happened in 1982 with this group coming over and taking over the school classrooms, the PLO purchased a land next to the camp. And it's interesting why, because when they purchased that land, they could not even put it under the names of Palestinians, because under the Lebanese law, Palestinians could not own a land. So what they did, they put it under the endowment of the Islamic affairs in Lebanon. The PLO bought it, gave it to the Islamic endowment, put it in their names, and allowed these new refugees to start building homes there. A little bit later, in the 1990s, the Lebanese farmers next to this new expanded area also started to offer their land for people in the camp if they want to move out and build. So many people actually invested all their money, or basically kids who wanted to move out because there's no room inside the camp. They bought lots in this new area. The same thing happened. Most of these lots were either registered in the name of a Lebanese, or they have what they call the power of authority. It is still in the name of the Lebanese owner, but there is an agreement between the new Palestinian owner and the landowner that this land now is owned by this Palestinian. And most of the time, they were able to build homes without, I would say, proper permits from the Lebanese government, because the Lebanese government will not issue permits for Palestinians to build outside the camp. And this area became the new camp. So now if you refer to, when people talk about Nahr al-Barid, they are likely to be talking about the old camp and the new camp. So this is part of that transformation. Like I said, started with being tents, then building, then accelerated expansion, then the new camp, and the last one is the destruction of the camp.
How many people were living in the camps when it was destroyed?
Yeah, the people living in the camp, there is the official figure and there's the real figure, and I'll explain the two. The official figure is around 30,000. The unofficial figure, which is the correct figure, is about 40,000. The reason the unofficial figure is that Palestinians who moved from the south or from Tel Zatar or other camps into the Nahr al-Bared area, they still were counted per the UN census under the other camp. So they were not counted as being part of Nahr al-Bared. So the unofficial, which is the more accurate count, is about 40,000. I would say maybe 30,000 in the proper camp and about 10,000 in the new camp.
Do you want something to drink, some water?
Yeah, my.
So maybe this is, you're talking about the camp, maybe this is a good time to talk about, you know, if I can ask maybe just about like some very personal early memories
Of the camp?
of the camp. Just like your visions of the camp, like your, that one room house, you know.
Oh, good.
You have two brothers, do you have sisters as well?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah, I'll talk about that.
Let's talk about like, just those very personal memories, whether they're, whatever comes to mind.
As I indicated earlier, I was the first child. I was the third now born, but the first child to have been born in a room with the tent sheets and regular walls. Then from there on, we grew to a family of 5 boys and one sister. My sister was the youngest. She was born in 1967. The house is, and this is an interesting part, the house was or consisted of 3 rooms. One room where we all slept in it, all the 5 boys and the girl. And the reason I said 5 boys and the girl, because my oldest brother, the 6th boy, slept with my dad in another room. But anyway, 5 boys and my sister, my grandma toward my paternal, my father's side, and my mother. We all slept in one room. The middle room was basically used for, when people come over, visit, for us to study sometimes, when we needed to study for school, or to just sit around the charcoal amber during cold winter. As you know, living in a 10-sheet home tend to be, very freezing in the winter and very sizzling hot in the summer. So the charcoal, charcoal amber was our way to try to warm up. At that time, we did not have any electricity, any power in the camp. And the sraj, we call it, or the kerosene lantern, lighter basically, was the way to lighten our dark rooms until we had electricity. And I still remember the first day vividly. The first day we had electricity at home. Usually as kids we would be playing in the neighborhood till after dark. But that day I remember, as dark was getting just dark, I said I want to go home because I want to see my dad when he turned on the lights. So it's an interesting experience in a way. But I think life in the camp was very difficult. But I must say that you don't know any better. I mean, you really think that's what life is all about. And when you don't have electricity, as an example, you don't know what is it like to have electricity. Or even when you have electricity, you may not even know what is it like when you don't have electricity. But in our case, we did not know what kind of improvement it would bring to life. The camp was, in a way, divided into also villages. What I'm trying to say here, that each neighborhood consisted of a village from Palestine. For some reason, somehow, actually, logically, each family lived in a certain area, and around them, their relatives or old neighbors. So the camp was divided into many villages. You will see the neighborhood Hara, we call it, the neighborhood of Samou'i, the neighborhood of Safuri, the neighborhood of Sa'sa, Amka, Birwa, so the Moon. So each village in Palestine had its own neighborhood in the camp. And that really created the connection to Palestine. I mean, it's true, up until 1997, I've never seen that part of historical Palestine. However, I've always understood it. Because I knew all the villages. Nobody ever told me about the villages. I knew them because I know the neighborhood of so and so, the neighborhood of Sa'sa, the neighborhood of the Moon. It's there. So I knew where they are from, where they came from. Each also kind of neighborhood or section had a public water fountain. In our area, close to our house, we had a public drinking water fountain beer. It has basically two faucets on that fountain, and it supposedly to provide water for all the neighborhood. So women, they line up early in the morning, around 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, to be the first one to get the turn when the water is turned on. And the water is turned on by the pump on the other side of the camp. And they start hauling water from this fountain to the home to fill the barrels, fill all the tanks inside the house, because the water was used for showers, was used to clean around the house, was used also for small edible gardens that we used to have, as I indicated early on. Each house almost had an edible garden, vines, grapevines. So the women tend to, I would say, spend about 2 or 3 hours every day hauling about 5-gallon tank on their head, 5-gallon tank on their hand, carrying it and walking back and forth until they replenish all the water needed for their homes. With the sewage, each neighborhood also had public bathrooms that was built. The water was built by the United Nations, the UNRWA, Worker Relief Agency. The same thing, they had public bathrooms in each neighborhood. And they were maintained also by UNRWA. So people, when they need to go to the bathroom, they had to go walk outside to the bathroom. After a while, people start, and some of them are, I would say, not legally, because the Lebanese government tried to limit the ability of people to build their own restrooms. So people start building underground septic tanks, leach tanks, really, not septic tanks, I must say, leach tanks, and they started to build bathrooms inside their homes. So that was one of the transition that I would say took place in the 60s, but very much so in the 70s after the entry of the Palestine Liberation Organization, where the public bathrooms were dismantled and people were able to build their own bathrooms within their quarters, so people don't have to walk in the middle of the night to a bathroom outside. Other part of life in the camp, I would say the school. The school system, we had a kindergarten for about 30 kids that was financed by UNICEF through a grant from UNICEF to UNRWA again. And UNRWA had it run in the camp. We were about 30 kids in the kindergarten. And then there's the elementary school and the middle school in the camp. Once you reach past the middle school, you go to high school, you would have to go to a Lebanese high school in Tripoli, which was about 10 miles south of the camp, because the camp did not have at that time high school. So you finish. I have memories of my life in the kindergarten, actually, with children. Of course, at the time, we're all children, and have to sit now back and remember some of those children where I built relationships that early on in life with, and many of them ended up dying, through the process. Not dying naturally, I mean, got killed, whether by an Israeli air raid or by natural disaster, but mostly from I mean, I would say Israeli air raids on the camp. Yeah,
Oh.
because, like I said, the camp, to me, the camp was really part of Palestine, somewhere else. So I never looked at the camp as being. I hate to say this, and hopefully it doesn't sound negative toward Lebanon, because I mean Lebanon, as a country has contributed a lot to the Palestinians in the sense of I would say facilitating their life. We have some issues, and we could talk about those issues, but at least for being there, allowing us to be there. However, I really never felt I was part of Lebanon. I always felt I was part of Palestine. Somewhere, somebody took a piece of Palestine and put it in North Lebanon, and that is my feeling. We've never, at least until those days, we've never had much interaction with the surrounding Lebanese community. We were very much independent. Even the economy of the camp was independent from the overall Lebanon economy. As you know, Palestinians in Lebanon, they were not allowed to work in about 70 trades. I mean, Palestinians in Lebanon, in a way, when it comes to labor, they were really illegals, in a way, illegals, where they cannot find jobs. So most of the jobs were either within the camp, and up till 2007, the camp really provided for like 60% of the employment. Still 40% had to work outside. So, and I must say, those who worked outside, even though the Lebanese system officially does not allow them to work on 70 trades, some of them were able to work illegally, you might say, or possibly they looked the other way because there was a need for that labor force. So up until, in my case, up until I finished my middle school and went to Tripoli to do high school, I really never had an interaction or a serious interaction or even a friend outside the camp. They all were within the camp, and in 1974, I believe, that's when I went to my high school. That was the first time I sat in a classroom with Lebanese students. And it's interesting how much we did not know about each other actually in the class. I mean, they would ask us questions, weird, we thought, questions about the camp, as if it was on another planet. We knew a little bit more about the Lebanese city because I mean, for us, it was a luxury to go to Tripoli, to go to watch a movie. And we did that, especially on special occasions like the Eid after Ramadan, or the big Eid a little bit after that. So in the Eid, it was our trip to Tripoli to watch movies. So we were a little familiar with Tripoli. However, the Lebanese students were very, very much ignorant of life in the camp and what camps are like. And honestly, I still remember one guy asking me if the camp was tents, tents still in the camp. And I asked him if he has ever gone to Syria. He said yes. And that's something I did not mention, by the way. Let me explain it before I get into that a little bit. The camp was also built around, on the two sides of the main road connecting Lebanon to Syria. So everybody who was going from Tripoli to Syria would have to go in the middle of the camp, basically. I mean, it's bisecting the camp into two parts. So I said, have you been to Syria? He said, yeah. I said, well, you've driven in the middle of the camp. Did you see tents? He said, no. I said, remember that place next to the river that you passed through? He said, yeah. I said, that's the camp. So his mentality was, and he was about 18 years old, because that was my second year in high school. I think 17 or 18 years old. He still even did not know how we lived in camps. And this is, like I said, 10 miles just north of the city, and he has driven many times through the camp. So there's that, that mentality still was there until I would say possibly late 70s. And after late 70s, the camp became commercially very active. and actually became the center of trade, I would say, north of Tripoli. And then the Lebanese surrounding community were very much part of the camp. And you could see them in the camp trading, dealing, buying, everywhere. So I would say up until late 70s, early 80s possibly, the camp was almost a no man land for the Lebanese neighbors. The early years for labor and for work in the camp, like I said, Palestinians were not able to work in 70 trades in Lebanon. However, some areas that they were able to work in, I would say construction and farming, especially in north of the camp. There is, they call Akkar region, which is basically fields, farms, huge farms. And many Palestinians worked in those farms, like daily picker, husbandman, working on trees, things of that nature. So that was the major income actually for the camp with the early stage. UNRWA, United Nations, again, a relief and work agency, I would say was the largest employer within the camp. UNRWA provided for sanitation in the camp, so they had to hire people from the camp to do that. Teachers for the schools, so they had to hire teachers from the camp to teach in the schools. And also produce, and this is an important point, produce really future teachers that migrated into the growing Gulf regions within the Arab world, the oil economies. If you look at it, many of the early Palestinians who moved into that areas were teachers. There was a paradigm shift, I would say, in the 70s, whereby engineers started to be the new migrant to that region. But in the 50s and 60s, it was teachers. So UNRWA was producing these teachers, and many of them worked in the growing oil economies. Like I said, another clinics. They had the clinics also. Clinics were many of the employees in the clinic, I would say nurses, the doctor, were mostly Lebanese. But of course, has a lot of also Palestinians work in the clinics. So these were the major areas of work for Palestinians within the camp, and it was provided by UNRWA. Moving into 1970 and after 1970 and getting close to the civil war in Lebanon, I would say there was another factor in employment. I'm not sure if I want to call it employment, but another source of income to the people in the camp, and that is the PLO. The PLO started to play a big economic role also in the camp, where they had people on their payroll, fighters and alike. And also, actually, they have a lot of social clubs within the camp, so they had to provide for those social clubs. So the PLO became also a major contributor to the economy of the camp in the mid-70s. And that's when the civil war started to take place. I mean, I would say between 73 and 75, when the civil war started, things were simmering in Lebanon. I mean, the tension was very clear. And I am not sure if I want to call it Christian-Muslim, tension or progressive reactionary tension, but I think, or even outsider and insider tension. But I think there is a case for all these, all the above. People exploited religion to create tension, and others exploited ideological agendas to exploit tension. And possibly outside sources exploited the division within Lebanon to take advantage of that and push toward war. During that, the civil war, this camp, Nahr al-Barid, was far from any major Lebanese city, so it was not really directly impacted by the civil war. To the contrary, being far, I think helped it grow economically because of the little impact the civil war had on the camp. So I would say starting the civil war on the camp started to grow economically much faster than any other period before the Civil War. Again, like I said, in the camp you would see traders buying ceramics, cattles. I mean, important. I'm talking about importing it from overseas, and then becoming distributors to all the Lebanese towns and villages around the camp. So the Civil War, I hate to say this, but it played a positive role on the economic growth of the camp. However, it really played a very negative impact on overall Lebanon. And I want to touch on that part a little bit, politically speaking. I think there was a dominant belief maybe that the Civil War was a Christian Lebanese civil war. However, the Palestinians played a role in the war, and I think the Palestinians diluted really the sectarian fighting. The reason being that the Palestinians were of either Christians or Muslims. They were part of the same progressive forces in the war. So they diluted that religious aspect of it. Also, many of the leaders of the Lebanese national movements were very much Christians that were pushed out of their towns in the sides that was controlled by the right wing, and lived in what was known as East Beirut and West Beirut. So they lived in West Beirut. So that really diluted, the progressive forces diluted the sectarian aspect of the war. However, Israel really wanted to promote the war as a civil war between factions, Christians and Muslims, because they always believed, since the 1950s, it wasn't something new, that their goal was to create a Lebanese or a Christian minority government controlled region in South Lebanon. I mean, there are the diaries of Dayan, Moshe Dayan, and Sharot, I'm not sure about her name, yeah. And in their diaries, basically, they called for trying to find a Lebanese Christian general who will be willing to work with them, so they can create a Christian government in Lebanon where they would be able, where they would be allies against the so-called perceived Muslim majority. So everyone really plays a role in that war, like I said. I mean, you cannot deny the fact that religion played a role in it. You cannot deny the fact that progressive left-wing, right-wing also played a role. And you cannot deny the role that Israel played to ignite the civil war, and that's especially through the military support that they provided to the right wing during the war. I mean, it was basically oil on the fire, and they continued providing oil as much as they can to continue to keep the fire going, because that way they really pulled the PLO from the south and got him lost into basically, you know, the civil war, and diverted their attention from fighting Israel. So they went in two places. They went by diverting the PLO attention from fighting Israel in the South Lebanon, and also they went by creating allies to them within the Lebanese society. And it stayed for over 10 years. And I have some strong memories of the civil war. While it did not impact the camp, and here in my book actually I talk about an individual who was a friend of mine from childhood. His name is Ahmed Sakina. Ahmed Sakina was when he was about 5 years old, 6 years old, he lost his dad. And he lived with his mom, two toddlers, and his older brother. Soon thereafter, his mom died. So basically, he had no one around but his older brother. His toddlers were taken over basically by his relatives, and took him to Syria and took care of them in that sense. Ahmad was, I would say, about 7, 8 years old. He stayed with his brother, and they took care of themselves. And I've known Ahmed very well up until I would say maybe 12, 13, 14 years old. Uh, Ahmed left school and he went and worked in a gas station in a Lebanese Christian village. Uh, and I still remember him coming back to the camp every once in a while, showing off with his new clothes and more money than we could dream of as kids in the camp or students in the camp. Until, of course, the Civil War erupted. And I detail the story a lot in the book, but basically what happened, some militia came and asked for him at the gas station because he was known to be of a Palestinian descent. They asked for him and asked him to go with them. When he refused, one of the militiamen basically slapped him in the face. Ahmed was physically strong, and he slapped him back, and he knocked him on the ground. He was shot in his leg, and then he was tied into a car, and basically was pulled and killed in the middle of the town. But Ahmed experience again. It's another child experience who died for no reason in the Civil War when he was about, I think, 16 years old. He just wanted to really make a living, and that's where the place he found where he found the job. But many people, I would say, from both sides here. I mean, I want to point out, I think they lost their lives for no reason, but being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and being killed mostly by people who had no value for life. Life in the camp almost is a dead end. I would have to say your way out of the dead end life in the camp for economic survival is to leave the camp. So people really raise their kids in trying to direct them toward education or even a trade that will lead them to live outside the camp. I must say my parents, by the way, and I'm proud of that, they both are illiterate. They don't know how to write or read. However, education for them was I would say of the utmost important. I mean, they really pushed me hard to study, and I knew from a young age that I was destined to be the first one in the family to leave the camp, to depart the camp. And I did it the first time in 1976 when I was sent to Iraq to finish my high school, the last year high school. The reason being, in Lebanon, because of the Civil War, the school system was shut down and there was no exams that you can take, official exams to graduate from high school. So my parents decided that I need to go somewhere else. And honestly, another reason, of course, is just to push me away from the situation where I might get involved with something else, and they want me to just leave. So they put me literally in a cargo ship in Tripoli and sent me to Cyprus, and from Cyprus gave me enough money to take a plane to Iraq. I had some names of people that I want to see who were from the camp, who also were going to study in Iraq. They went there just about 2-3 weeks, maybe a month before I left. But I had no way of contacting them, just names in Baghdad. And just to make the story short, in the plane I met a Palestinian from Jerusalem who first really did not communicate with me much because we were taking Alia, a Jordanian airline. And Jordanian airlines are known to have what you might say, they plant spies or military officers in the plane. And I said something negative about the Jordanian regime when the plane was just leaving Jordan. And I think that scared the guy off a little bit. Maybe he was afraid I would be a plant. And he didn't talk much until we almost got to Baghdad. Over Baghdad, he started asking me where I'm from, where am I doing, where I'm going. And I told him, that I have some people in Baghdad, I'm going to look for them. and it was like late at night. So he suggested that I take you with me. You stay overnight with me. I have a small flat, and the next day I'll drop you at the General Union of Palestine Students, where you would be able to connect with those guys. I mean, again, that was another godsend. I know where he came from. I mean, just happened to sit next to me in the plane. And honestly, I don't know what I would have done in the middle of the night in Baghdad. I wouldn't even know where to go next day if he did not suggest the union, the student union. So we went, and he had basically not a flat, really, a one-room area with a little kitchenette. I slept in his room, and next day I took my suitcase and with him, and he took me in a bus to the General Union of Palestine student in Baghdad. And from there, when I mentioned these students from the camp, they told me where they're staying at the hotel, at a hostel, you know. I went there and I found some, and there I got connected, and I finished my high school in Baghdad. So that was really my first year out of the camp. I went back. I mean, I always knew, maybe before that, when I finish high school, I want to try to attempt to go to the US to finish my college. So when I went back to the camp, basically that's what I did. I started to prepare for my leaving the camp again, and now to the US. And I left Lebanon to the US in December 1977. From there, of course, I went through many changes in my life until I graduated as a civil engineer, and then became professional civil engineer, chartered civil engineer in California. Later on in life, I went and had MBA in global management. Throughout the years, of course, you know, I was also active in the Palestinian politics in the U.S., whether working with other Palestinian students, or with the American public, trying to educate them on the Palestinian plight or dilemma, if I could say that. Up until uh, 1969, like I said, things were quiet, but I do remember my own political evolution vividly. I still remember it. In 1964, I was six years old, about 65, sorry, 7 years old. And there was a visit by what is called, his name, the president of Tunisia. His name is Al-Habib Bourguiba. I still remember his visit to Lebanon in 1965, to Beirut, when there was a huge demonstrations in Lebanon, and in the camp, of course, there was one. The reason being, in 64, Bourguiba called for the recognition of Israel and for the partition of Palestine. The refugees rejected his call for one simple reason, that it did not also call for the return of refugees to their homes. So people resented his call for recognition of Israel without calling for the return of refugees, or at least give them an option whether they want to return or not. And that was my first demonstrations. Like I said, I was 7 years old. And I still remember vividly even the slogans in that demonstrations. One is "Ya Bourguiba, Ya Khanzir, Biddak Rabat Bil Janzir," which means, "Oh, you Bourguiba, you pig, you need to be tied in a chain." And "Ya Bourguiba, Ya Akrut, Biddak Shujabak ala Beirut," which is, "Oh, you Bourguiba, you brute, what brings you to Beirut?" Something like that. And I still remember the lead chant for that demonstration. His name was Nasser. Nasser was killed, actually, I would say 3-4 years after that, in a small clash between his organization, which was part of the Pan-Arab Nationalist Party, which turned into the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. He was killed in a clash with the Lebanese army at the edge of the camp. That was in 65. 67, I would say maybe that was my second big demonstration. And that is after the Arab defeat in June. Uh, there, with the Arab defeat in 1967 war, Nasser, the president of Egypt, resigned as a president, and then a promptu demonstrations throughout the Arab world asking him to remain in power and continue the fight. And there was one of the largest demonstrations, possibly the largest in the camp. And we started marching into Tripoli because there was another big, huge demonstration also in Tripoli. We wanted to join that demonstration. And it would take about an hour and a half to get to Tripoli walking. And then in the middle of the way, I still remember it when we got the news that he came back and withdrew his resignation. And then we dismantled the demonstration and went back home. But those two demonstrations, I must say, they were the first, the embryo, if I could say that, for my political evolution that continued from that point on. And when you live in that environment, it's very, I would say, politicized environment, whether you know it directly or indirectly. But the environment has the biggest impact on how kids grow. I mean, you could, of course, also grow to give up and just feel like a defeated individual, or and accept the conditions you live under, or at least try to understand it in a more positive way, and try to grow up within an environment that will contribute to hopefully positive change in the future. I would say, that is the kind of environment we grew up with, and hopefully it left a positive impact on all of us.
So as you were growing up, did you, and you were politicized, did you join any of the PLO factions? And do you want to talk anything about that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's in the book now. So.
Okay, so it's public knowledge.
Yeah, it's public. Actually, as I said earlier, the two demonstrations in 65 and in 67, they really were the embryo for my political evolution. Soon after that, there was a big battle in Jordan, Al-Karama battle in March 21, 1968. And I would say that is a battle that really brought the PLO to the forefront, because they stood up to an Israeli attack soon, less than a year after the big Arab defeat. And people, especially Palestinians, but in the Arab world also, they were rallying around the PLO as being the new hope to fight in the state of Israel. Around that time, we started to organize as kids in the camp. We wanted to do something, and there I was 10 years old. A year later, actually, we conspired, five of us, 4 friends and myself. We conspired to go and join a military base camp in Syria. At that time, the PLO was not yet in Lebanon, so we had to go and cross the border illegally into Syria. So we were, by the way, and that is part of life in the camp, people usually do something on the side to supplement their income. You get some income from your parents, but it's very, very, very minimal. So we would work actually things like gather sand for construction and sell it for builders. Another one, we used to sell even bones for buyers. They take it and make animal bones here. I'm talking about dry bones. They take it and make cups and plates and things, those kind of manufacturers. We used to do that. We used to do a lot of other things to supplement our income. Sell copper that we find in the trash, basically like old wires, and sell the copper. So we started to work out a plan where we wanted to go to Syria. We needed the money, so we started working a plan to do that. And the day came One guy sold an old used watch. Another guy actually got 5 Lebanese pounds from his home. Uh, he took him. Uh, and we decided to go now to Syria. And Lebanon was still, like I said, under the camp was still under the Lebanese forces. And anybody who does that would endanger going to jail, by the way, in Lebanon, because we were not allowed to join the revolution. And if they know that anybody joined the revolution, even if he comes to visit, they would pick him up. Or any activist in the camp who did not even join the revolution, they would pick him up. There was what they called Maktab al-Thani, which is it's the intelligent, I mean the intelligent unit of the police. Its job was to monitor the political activities in the camp. There was a police station and this intelligent unit station. And this intelligent unit station would monitor the activities in the camp and would pick anybody who was active. So we were endangering ourselves. For that reason, we were doing it secretly. So we had a guy who was 2 or 3 years my senior, who claimed that he has joined the revolution from a previous visit in Syria, and agreed to take us with him to the base. So we decided to meet outside the camp at a point. Each one would walk separately. We would go meet at a certain point outside the camp, so nobody would see us, nobody would know what we're doing. And we would take a taxi to the Syrian border, and then from there we would cross. The plan worked successfully, actually. It was easily implemented. We were kids. I was 11 years old. And the others, all of them were, like Churchill was 3 years older than I. The others were a year at least older than myself. 1 year older than myself, the others. And Churchill was the Churchill is a nickname, by the way. He was 2 years older or 3 years older than me. And we took the car to the Syrian border. And at the Syrian border, at the Lebanese border first, we just walked across. Nobody even asked us because, we were kids. Nobody suspected we trying to pass the checkpoint illegally, because there were some farms on the other side, Lebanese farms, on the other side of the checkpoint. So they would think, we're part of possibly going back and forth to the farm. We just walked, and then we crossed the river. There is a big river dividing Lebanon and Syria. They call it the big river, actually, Nahr al-Kabir. So we crossed the river north of the Syrian also checkpoint, and we just walked into Syria. And from there we took, I detail it a lot more in the book, but just to make the story short, we make it all the way to Damascus. At the end of the day, we take a small bus, also a van, and that takes us to Al-Hama, which was a major base in Damascus. And from there we walked into the base, and we were, I still remember it, kids, when we got to the guard outside, we told him we're here to join the revolution, and he just chuckled. He laughed. These kids, what the heck are they doing to join the revolution? So he took Churchill, who was the oldest, and who has been there before, to the base commander, and the base commander was livid for him coming back and now bringing these kids with him. So the base commander called us, and we walked in there, and when he saw us, he just took Churchill to the other room and he flogged him. He really hit him with a stick on the palm of his feet, to the point where he started to cry and scream. And then he came back to us with Churchill crying and said, "Go back to school," and basically slapped us on the back and sent us back. At that point, we didn't have any money, actually. We spent all the money now to get to the base. Enough money only for the van ride back to Damascus. The guy did not ask us. He assumed, I guess, we had money. So we took a van back to Damascus, and we had no place to sleep, nothing to eat. We spent eventually a night. I don't want to spend too much into this, but we spent the night in the mosque, sleeping on the floor in the mosque. And next day we decided to beg for money. We couldn't work, little kids. And as we started actually begging, that tormented me, I must say. It was very hard for me to really extend my hand to ask for my handouts. Churchill was much better than I, and he did that. And I was really tormented to the point where I started crying. I just could not stand it. And people, it worked, I guess, in a way to our advantage, because people saw me, and I was genuinely crying, really. They had some empathy or sympathy toward us, and they gave us some money. Until one guy came and asked, "Why are you guys doing this?" So we explained to him that we're stranded, basically, and we have no place to go. Uh, I mean, that guy was God sent. I don't know if you believe in angels, but almost like that. He gave us money, and then he said, "I tell you what, there, you go about 4 blocks that way." He pointed toward a cart, and he said, "By that cart, there is a building that hosts a civilian office of the organization that we were trying to join the night before. Go tell them, about your situation. They might help you." We went directly, and luckily, actually, they did. They took us, and it seems like they're possibly used to it. They're used to having these children come in and ask for help to go back. And when we told him the story, he made us sign some receipts, and he gave us each 5 Syrian pounds. That was enough to take us back to the camp. But that was the first, I would say, attempt for me to join the PLO. But at home, my dad and mom, of course, were worried. I mean, 11 years old. When my dad saw me walking on the beach, I mean, I was afraid, honestly, to go home. I mean, I'm not sure. I wasn't sure what's going to happen to me, how mad my parents are at me just walking out like that. When I got to close to our neighborhood on the shorelines, and there my dad was standing just by coincidence, actually. And he looked at me and smiled and said, "Come in." So I went there, and he did nothing really. He gave me a kiss and a hug, and he introduced me to an older guy, saying, "This is the son that went to join the revolution." And we walked home, and he never asked me anything. He really never did. And I think a sense of, he was worried, very worried about me, but I think he was proud at the same time, in a way. I really felt it in him, in the way he introduced me to the other older guy. The same thing, mom, of course, was the happiest, not just for being back, but for being kicked out. And that was my first experience, I would have to say, with the PLO. Up until 2005, when actually before that, I did also in 1996 decided to go and interview with the United Nations in Gaza, when Gaza was turned over to the Palestinian Authority. I worked there for about 6 months, to the point where I really honestly could not continue for personal and other than personal reasons. And I left back, and I went back to the States in 1997. But that period allowed me to really see Palestine, historical Palestine as it is, and connect with some distant relatives that I've never met, all my life.
Did you go and visit your village, your parents' village?
Yeah, I did. I
What's
went.
it called now? Is it
Next to Al Zib, but now they live in Shfa'amr, basically. All the Palestinians in that region, they gathered them in Shfa'amr. And this is an interesting meeting, by the way.
Is the village still called Al Zib, or was destroyed?
Al Zib, no, they called I named it in my book, actually, the new name, but they have a different Hebrewnification, if I could say.
Exactly.
They made a Hebrew name for
But
it.
there are no Palestinians living in it? It's
No,
all
no
Jews?
Palestinians live in it. It's all Israeli Jews that live in it, with, like I said, a Hebrew name that was taken from it, Zib. Very similar to Al Zib, but I mean in Hebrew they made it.
What does Al Zib mean, by the way? I don't know.
That's a good question. Let me put it this way: when you see Al something, it's the something in Arabic. So it is an Arabic name, but I really have no idea Al Zib. I could not really figure it out. But there was a website, Palestine Remembered. I think they explained it. I forgot
I'll
what
look
it is.
it up, yeah.
But yeah. Actually, my meeting with my distant relatives is another story, by the way. In 1996, when I went to the interview with the United Nations, I went just for the interview and I was coming back to San Diego. But I decided, they took me to the airport basically. Meanwhile, I made arrangements really to go back from the airport to the West Bank. I called the airline and I postponed the trip, but I didn't tell the United Nations because they don't want to be responsible for that part. So I changed all my reservation and they dropped me at the airport. As far as they knew, I went back. I went back from the other door, basically took a charut, like a small van, and went back to Jerusalem and planned to spend a couple of days in there. And the second day I was there, I went to Bethlehem, to Ramallah first, walked around, just walking, and then to Bethlehem. I visited, the Church of Nativity, and on my way out back, I don't know what happened honestly till now. I was in a taxi. We were moving into Jerusalem. I only remember just the outskirts of Bethlehem. That's all I remember. And then there was a huge accident in the car with a bus by an area called Al-Azariya, where I was knocked out completely. I had serious concussion. And I was taken to the Hadassah hospital. And from there, I think I was given induced coma because, like I said, they were not sure whether I had hemorrhage or not. So they wanted to investigate that. So they give you induced coma. So I was in coma for a while. And the American embassy called my wife to tell her what happened in San Diego, and my wife and my brother who was staying with us started calling people all over to see if they could go. All over being within Jerusalem or the 1948 Palestine, to see if somebody could go and check on me or visit me. And there I was lying in bed, half conscious or more than half unconscious actually, where my distant relatives got a call from a cousin of mine, or through a cousin of mine in Denmark, to tell them that the son of so and so, because they know my father, they don't know me. They said the son of Krayim had an accident and he is in a serious condition in Hadassah Hospital in Ein Karim, Jerusalem. So these poor guys, 6 in the morning, they get the call. The guy doesn't go to work. He goes to his uncle, who's an older guy, tell him that the son of your relative is in the hospital. So both of them, with 2 women who are the daughters of my father's aunt. Her name is Amsha, and I've known of Amsha all my life. I've never seen her, but my dad did talk about his memories and how Amsha, his father's sister, stayed behind in Palestine, and they've never seen each other since 1948, and how his dad, my grandfather, died without seeing Amsha. And later on in 68, I think 69, Amsha died also without my father even know about her dying until many years later. So anyway, these 2 women comes with this young man, and this older man comes to the room full of patients, 4 or 5 patients in the room, sleep basically, and they look around and they decide to check on me, and maybe this is the guy. They told them only this guy in room so and so. So they went to the room, like I said, full of patients, and they looked around and they decided to take chance on me and call me by name. And I was asleep. So they called me, and I opened my eyes, and I just looked at an older guy with an Arab, garb and all that, head kufiya, and 2 women with a Palestinian dress. And this is, by the way, what was told to me, because like I said, I was completely out of it. And they said, I just looked around them when they called my name, and just without saying anything, I just kept looking, because I really, possibly, I didn't know where I was. I kept looking around, and then I looked at the women, and I said, "Are you the daughter of Amsha?" And they started crying and kissing. They couldn't believe I would call their mother's name. Who died over 20 years before. I mean, they couldn't believe even I knew of her. So I got connected there, and they took me to their village after my wife arrived. And we
lived in Shafam.
Shfamer. So I stayed with them in Shfamer for 2 days, 3 days until after leaving the hospital. I stayed in the hospital like 3-4 days only because by the fourth day, I believe, they decided that I don't have any hemorrhage. I still had a memory problem. My short-term memory was completely gone, but I wasn't in a critical condition at that stage. So they took me to Shfamer, and they worked with us until we got our tickets rearranged, and left back to San Diego. And then 3 months later, I went back to Palestine for the job. And like I said, I stayed there for about 6 months. So we were able to connect with that part of that family in historical Palestine. And that was an opportunity for me and for my wife also to visit her village and my village. My wife has a story. Her grandpa does not eat pomegranate since he left Palestine. And the reason was his pomegranate tree just in his yard was so good in that sense, delicious. He just decided he's never going to eat pomegranate after that. So one of the things she did actually, she picked a pomegranate from the tree.
From the tree.
From the tree.
What village was it?
Safuri.
In Safuri,
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And she took it and gave it to her grandpa.
From the same tree?
From the same tree.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So it was a nice connection between, back to people that we've never met. We never even knew how they were living. But I find that we still have the same commonality. We're living in different worlds basically, but we're still the same in our belonging, our sense of belonging to the land. In 2007, actually 2006, I was planning to go to visit my parents in the summer of 2006. And just 2 days before my travel, there was a war, 34 days of war basically, the Israeli attacks in Lebanon, and one of the places they destroyed basically the airport. So the airport was closed for that period of time. I wasn't able to make it. Then I decided to go in 2007. The same thing, I was going toward the end of June 2007. In May 20th, there was a war between the Lebanese army and a small faction called Fath al-Islam that existed in the camp, where the war continued through the summer of 2007, so I wasn't able to go. But to go back a little bit on this war, Lebanon is weird in a way, where how can I say it, where the division and sectarian division, the political division, sometimes plays a more important role than the national interest of the country. Back in, I believe, May of 2005, the Lebanese parliament decided to release from prison a convicted murderer, and who is called Samir Jaja, the head of the Lebanese forces, as part of the reconciliation in Lebanon. And the way they do it there, you release a Christian also, you should release some other Muslims convicted, political, you want to call it, convicted murderers also. So they released a group called Al-Daniya, a group, which is a Lebanese Muslim fundamentalist group. Because they released Jaja, so they released these guys also. These guys continue to be active in their, both actually, Jaja and the Muslims also, in their areas of political or military activities. In 2006, a small group of fighters established what they called Fatah al-Islam. Fatah is the name of an organization. So by adding the word al-Islam to it, basically what they're saying, this is the religious group. And most of the members of this new group were from outside the camp, but for one person that I know very well, actually, who was like the deputy chief of the group. But the military, oh no, he was the military chief. The deputy chief actually was one of those Lebanese who were released in May of 2005. So basically, this organization was really mostly people from outside the camp. And I would say the biggest part was the ones that were released from Lebanese jail. This group was indirectly promoted by Lebanese forces, by the Al-Mustaqbal party, which is really the party of the prime minister. The reason being, indirectly I said, promoted, because it represented to them the military counterpart of the Shiites, Hezbollah. So that way, at least the Sunni would have also their military power, and the Shiites have their own military power. Until a point where now conflict started. Basically, it's very similar to what the US did in Afghanistan. You know, they helped the Taliban and Osama bin Laden himself until the genie got out of the bottle and they could not control it. The same thing, it seems that these right-wing philosophers or strategists have very myopic strategic thinking. So this group now got out of the bottle, the genie got out of the bottle, and they could not control it. This group was getting financial support from certain areas within the Arab world. Certain areas, when I say that, really right-wing areas like Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, and they went to pick up their money from the Mediterranean Bank in a village called Kalamon, just south of Tripoli. When I think somehow the Lebanese government now decided they're going to stop this source of funding to this group, and they refused to give them the money. Next day, they took over the camp and they took their money. They did not take anything actually other than their money. They took their money and left the camp. The Lebanese security forces found their hideout place in Tripoli. They did not coordinate with the Lebanese army. The security attacked the building in the middle of the night. And during the attack, the group members called their comrades, you want to say, in the camp. And that person is called Abu Huraira. He's the Lebanese who was released in 2005 from Lebanese prisons, and told them that we are being massacred by the Lebanese army and we need your support. He takes a group, he goes and he attacks an outpost of the Lebanese army by the camp, and then basically things break loose, and the Lebanese army blockaded the camp and started shelling everywhere in the camp, not just the military centers. This group really existed on the edge of the camp, in an area that I mentioned earlier, the new camp, on the outskirts of the new camp. So it's outside the old camp. But the Lebanese forces, for one reason or another, was intent to destroy the camp proper and not just fight the Fatah al-Islam. Even though the Palestinian groups, all of them, they condemned, and the people of the camp, they condemned what the Fatah al-Islam did. And as a sign of support to the Lebanese army, actually, most of the people left the camp to let them finish, the whole work, and then they could come back to the camp. But that was the biggest mistake, I think, that they did when they left the camp, because the Lebanese army basically felt more free now to shell the camp itself. My parents stayed in the camp till the second week of June, so maybe 2-3 weeks after the whole thing started. And I remember talking to them on the phone and hearing explosions all over the place. And the thing my parents were saying, we really don't want to go through the same thing that we've gone through 60 years ago. Seeing people leaving the camp like that, it was like seeing people leaving their villages. And we really want to stay, up to the point where at that stage, the Red Cross was able to provide water and food to those who remained, about 10,000 people. At that stage, the Lebanese army wanted them out, so they cut basically all the food and water delivery to the camp, and they started to evacuate the remaining civilians. And my view, and I detail it in the book a lot, my view is that even as a non-military neophyte, I would say it would have been a lot easier for the Lebanese army to isolate Fath al-Islam, who were numbered, very small number by the way. They claim about 300, the Lebanese army. From my other resources that I did through real investigation in the camp itself, there were about 98 exactly members of Fath al-Islam, which is very small group. I mean, if you cut their hair and distribute it all over the camp, they will not fill the 6,000 homes that were destroyed in that battle. So the Lebanese army could have isolated this group where it existed at the edge of the camp and fight it there instead of pushing them into alleys nobody even can walk into, unless the intention is really to destroy the camp. And I believe strongly that the intention is really to destroy the camp, not to fight this group. This group was used as an excuse to dismantle the camp. And there are theories, many theories about that, and I have my own, of course, theories about it. But that's what they want. Another factor, and this is very important factor, 2 years later, after the destruction of the camp, they arrested a Lebanese general. His name is Mansour Diab. They arrested him, who was one of the leading figures in the Battle of Nahr al-Bared. They found out that he's been working with Israel for about 14 years. So I really suspect other forces within Lebanon were really directing this battle, not necessarily even the army, but possibly some parts of the army that's still connected either to Israel or to the right-wing militia, because when they went into the camp, and you could see the writing on the walls, there were racist writings on the wall, basically shaming people for having these homes. Why do you even live in these homes? Things like that. So it is really politically motivated, if not even more connected to Israel. And one would say, why? Why would they do that? I mean, my biggest point is that dismantling a camp is the camp. What did the camp represent for Palestinians? A refugee camp for Palestinians represent an identity outside the land of Palestine, an identity that calls for their right of return to their homes. It really symbolized that fact that these people were forced out of their homes in 1948. By dismantling it, you really dismantling the identity that calls for the return. That means it is one obstacle that would be removed from the so-called peace process. Because one of the main obstacles in the peace process, as many people would know, Jerusalem and the refugee rights. So by dismantling camps or a camp, you're removing one obstacle from the peace process. That was a major point, I believe, in the whole in the war to destroy the camp. To make the story short now, the camp with 6,000 homes was completely demolished. When people went back they allowed to go back to check into their homes about 4 months after the complete destruction. I mean, people were able, or would have been able to, if not rebuild some aspects within the camp, they would have been able, if they were allowed, at least to save their house, goods or belongings. They were not allowed. They only were allowed to go spend 15 minutes and take whatever you can take in your hands. And mostly people try to take, identification papers, because when they left again, they really did not know that they're not going to come back or come back to a destroyed place. So they looked for their paperwork, identifications and things of that nature. Another important thing, they looked for pictures, because their memories were also there. And to their disappointment, those memories were in many places completely destroyed intentionally. I mean, see, these each home has a lot of pictures that really preserve their memories of their old, their people basically. And it seems like were maliciously destroyed after the entry of the Lebanese army. And many of the homes were imploded. That means they were destroyed after the entry of the Lebanese forces, because they really are the Lebanese army. They intended to make sure that there would be no room for the camp to be rebuilt. Even though the international condition now is forcing them to start rebuilding the camp, even though slowly, this is now 2010, and I'm talking about a war that took place in 2007, in summer 2007, 3 years ago exactly. And barely, I would say less than 2% of the camp is being rebuilt. It's very, very slowly. They use some legal definitions sometimes to stop the rebuilding of the camp. As an example, some right-wing party claims that the camp was built on a historical, not historical, on what do they call it? Old ruins, some old ruins, a thousands of years old village. And this is in a place, in a camp where every house had a septic tank or a leach tank under it. So it was a pre-disturbed construction area for 60 years at a time. So under even archaeological understanding or analysis, people would say that if it's a pre-disturbed area, basically the archaeological presence does not exist there anymore. It was removed. So nevertheless, this right-wing group claimed that there's an archaeological site under the camp, and maybe we should stop allowing them to build. And the archaeological site, the discovery of the archaeological site, this is almost a joke. They found pipes, like clay pipes, which is really were for the septic tanks. They found walls underground, which is septic tanks. They found stones in the camp, which is like I said earlier, many of the walls for the camp homes, the early homes, were built with stones. They dug the stones and built those homes. The court in Lebanon finally agreed to allow the construction to continue, however, with one condition, that they're not allowed to disturb under the ground. So now they're building the foundation on the top of the ground, which means it will add almost 25 to 30, even 40% cost, because you're building a huge foundation instead of building, pointed foundation in certain areas. And that is just an extra money that they're wasting.
Where are your parents living now?
Well, when my father had the permission to go and visit the house, or the destroyed house, the way he identified the house, actually, there was a storage tank on the top. And when my cousin was with him, when they went, he took her with him to check. She will check her house, which is next to our house, and he wanted to check our house. And when they walked, from what they told me, they walked on the top of the ruins. It wasn't like alleys that existed. It's just ruins of homes, and they basically moved from one house to another on the top of the houses. And then he looked when they got to the area, because they knew they got to the area because the sea is close by. So he knew that the house must be around this area. They looked and he saw the water tank, and he said, "Oh, this is our house, see the tank." And my cousin said, "Well, where is our house then?" And he said, "You're standing on it." I mean, that much. Anyway, he took what he found, IDs, like I said, identifications, paper only, and he went back home. That was on a Friday. And my mom was still hoping that she will salvage something from the house. Really, she somehow believed she will be able to find something. And when he got they were staying in a flat in Tripoli at the time. When he went back, she asked him, what happened? What did you find? He said the terminology in Arabic, al-awad bi Allah, or our compensation is with God, meaning that everything is gone, is lost, we don't have anything. Next day, my sister was talking to my mom on Saturday from San Diego, and I used to call them every Thursday. For that Thursday, I did not call. I got busy. I did not talk to her. So she was talking to her on Saturday, and my mom was out of nowhere, start saying to my sister that Jamal is calling. He's gonna call. And she wasn't all together when she was talking. And my sister was worried. What's wrong with you? Why you keep saying Jamal is gonna call? What's happening? She could not understand, my sister, of course. But I think in the back of her head, why I didn't call. On Sunday evening, we received a call from my sister crying, and basically saying my mother had stroke. So what happened after my dad came back, like I said, it must have been distressful for her. So Sunday she had stroke. You know, she survived until now. She survived, but she ended being you know, basically completely disabled. She lost her vision. She's living now with my brother, who was one of those who bought a lot or plot in the new camp. His house was almost demolished. Actually, the Lebanese army attempted to demolish it by trying to blow up the columns. But thankfully, due to their incompetence, and I inspected it at the time actually when that happened, like 2 months or 6 months after that, when I visited. Basically, the rebars touch, you could see the rebars in the column, but what happened, the load basically went down and settled on the walls. The walls were still standing, and the home wasn't destroyed, and he ended up reinforcing the columns. So now they're staying with him in there. So it's the sad thing about this is that they, you know, worked so hard to build their own home after 60 years living in a refugee camp, but at least they have a home, a sense of belonging, their own rooms. And now they ended up staying homeless again. They basically have no home, staying with their son, who's taking good care of them, no question about it. And my mom, I think now with her memory being gone, she just thinks they took her from her home. She wants to go, you know, her home. So she keeps saying to them, I want to go home, you know, I don't want to stay here. I mean, I want to go home. She doesn't now at the stage where she really does not know where things are. But anyway, I mean, her vision is completely gone. Physically, she's disabled. And now basically it's the sunset of her life, really. But the sad, as I said, is for her to have this sunset on her life, and my dad to a point, when they start or don't have anything to start with, really. And the truth is, they are somehow the lucky ones. Even as sad as it is, they are the lucky ones because they have someone to provide for them. Many others don't even have that.
Jamal, I want to thank you so very much.
You're welcome.